Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Adams, and I am a member of the Executive Committee with Karanga and the Editor-in-Chief for the Knowledge Hook Signature Leadership Series. And it's a thrill to welcome you here to our live seminar, which is part of the SEL Global Leadership Series. It's a thrill to introduce you to the three partners that have come together. They came together last spring when the pandemic hit, and certainly the intention was at first to continue on just throughout the spring, but we certainly know that 2020 is continuing to be a challenging year, and the three partners have decided to continue on with these monthly webinars. Our topic for today is education in a state of emergency, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. We know that this is a topic that's in the forefront of our minds. Our first partner is Karanga, and Karanga is a brand new global alliance for SEL and life skills. And the thought is a number of leaders around the world coming together to say, what will it take for learners to be enabled to thrive in school, in work, and in life? And we think it's a combination, that broad set of skills, which includes social emotional learning. And so this organization is working on 4 different areas: advocacy, creating a connected network around the world, and providing implementation support and cutting edge research. So that's our first partner. Our second partner is Salzburg Global Seminar. And Salzburg Global Seminar is an international nonprofit that came into being right after the Second World War. And it was leaders that got together that thought we need to have an opportunity to host sessions that will help move the world into a more peaceful and prosperous and equitable world for everybody. And that work obviously continues. There are now fellows in over 180 different countries and are providing lots of thought leadership, trying to make this world a better place. And the third partner is a partner, it's a Canadian digital math company, and they provide solutions for helping build capacity of teachers that are teaching math, typically in the elementary grades, that don't really have a strong background in math. And in addition to that, they have sponsored the Signature Leadership Series, which is really designed for senior education leaders around the world. And it is, all of the resources are free. And at the end of the session, I'll show you where you can be signing up for that. But we've got videos and podcasts and what we're reading, and it's a great site. So we welcome you there. It's really exciting to be able to tell you that we have registrants from 7 different Canadian provinces, from 21 US states, and 28 countries. And it really goes to show you that these topics are really important and relevant right now. And many of the people that register, some come live, but based on time zones, etc., some register to be able to get the on-demand version. And just wanted to say that we will be sharing that out with the participants and all of the registrates. So it's my thrill to be able to introduce you to the host, and our host is Louka Parry. He is an amazing friend and colleague of mine coming out of Australia. He is one of the other executive committee members for Karanga, and he's the CEO of The Learning Future. And what I love about what Louka does, he's an incredibly inspirational speaker and has lots of good ideas. And I certainly learn something every time that I'm involved with him in a conversation. So I know you will as well. So Louka, over to you, and to introduce our wonderful panelists.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's a tough introduction to live up to, but good morning or good afternoon, good evening, colleagues from wherever you're joining us here today. My name is Louka Parry, and I'm on Kaurna country here in South Australia on our small family farm, riding out the incredible year that 2020 has been for all of us. You know, all of us have been affected in some way, and of course that is the key topic and theme that we want to explore here today. Thankfully, there's going to be less of me and more of these 2 wonderful panelists that have offered their insights and expertise and passion here today. Both Anya and Carine have really remarkable experience and some really powerful things to say, and both will give a presentation that kind of outlines really the state of where we are right now. You know, we have titled the theme of today, Education in a State of Emergency. And what we're trying to do is something rather interesting. We're trying to combine, some of the really powerful insights from the field of education in emergencies, which of course is trying to consider how do we best support young people, but frankly all people, to be able to thrive, to be resilient in crisis and conflict areas around our globe. But also, what can we learn from a strengths-based perspective about that field and apply to everybody? Because as human beings, as you may have seen in the intro for this particular seminar, we are not well equipped for chronic long-term levels of stress. We have actually evolved to respond quickly to acute stress. And so that has implications. And if there is one singular word that sums up 2020, and I'm sure many of us would have our own views on this, it would probably be anxiety or disruption. There is a really remarkable amount of anxiety in our schools, in our communities, in our systems, in our societies. And so how do we best respond to that? And how do we be as proactive as possible? And rather than intervene, try to be interventionist, try to be preventionist in the way that we design our education systems, both in crisis and conflict zones, but also in your local community, wherever you happen to be joining us from. So we have 3 questions that we'd like to orbit around as well today. And the first question is, what has been learned from conflict and crisis contexts that can help all young people universally? And so that's something that we really want to try to consider as we delve into this 1 hour together. Question 2 is, what are the strategies school and district leaders can use to provide psychosocial support to students and staff so that learning can effectively take place? If we don't feel well, how can we learn well? And Carine and Anya will both kind of take us through what is psychosocial support for some of us that may not have heard that term before. And also, how does that link to social and emotional learning? And how do we integrate those 2 things in a powerful way? And ultimately, what are the tangible ways that leaders can create environments that help students and staff thrive in times of long-term uncertainty? And this is our present moment. So to our panel today, we have Anja Nielsen, who will be leading us out. She's the Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor for Education and Youth at Unicef in the UK. And we also have Carine Allaf, who will be following on from Anya with a presentation also, who's the Senior Programs Advisor at Qatar Foundation International, based in the USA. So I'll give you a little bit more about Anya before handing over to her to take us through some of her insights from her unique vantage point in our global learning ecosystem. Anya is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor for Education and Youth at Unicef. She joined in June of 2019, which I'm sure seems like 12 years ago now, Anya, not, just over a year ago. In her role, she leads the organization's domestic and international education policy, focusing on education for refugee, asylum-seeking, and migrant children within the UK and abroad. She's particularly interested in the impact of climate change-induced migration on children's access to education systems, as well as smoothing the transition through education for refugee and asylum-seeking children in the United Kingdom. She has a background working with teachers, youth programs, and international development policy across a range of organizations. And of course, lots of interesting things to pick up there, and not least of all, the movement of peoples and the fact that climate change has been, put into a sideline somewhat through this particular pandemic in which we find ourselves. So really looking forward to hearing some insights from you. So I will hand the floor to you, and we'll see if we can get these slides up and we can move forward from there. But thank you so much for joining us, Anya.
Thanks so much, Louka. Am I having some slight technical difficulties? Oh no, here we go. Excellent. What a great start to an event about the challenges of education and distance learning in some ways. So as Louka said, my name is Anja Nielsen. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at Unicef UK. So we're the National Committee for UNICEF in the United Kingdom. And my work at Unicef UK spans both domestic and international advocacy, which I think certainly allows me a lot of learning and offers me the opportunity to have insights into different perspectives across different education systems. And I've titled my presentation today, Unlocking Learning Now and Post-COVID. And I really wanted to talk through and kind of think through some of the lessons that we've learned from COVID around mental health, some lessons we had beforehand, and some of the lessons that we want to carry with us after the pandemic subsides. or as we continue to move through the pandemic, as it's increasingly being seen as. So I think many of us, I'm sure, I'm not saying anything controversial when I say that we understand that mental health is an unlocker for learning. Positive mental health is an unlocker for learning. And I think COVID-19 has really shown that. But it was certainly already known in many refugee settings. So emotional trauma can affect cognitive, emotional, social development, increase academic challenges. These are things that have been well documented by a number of organizations, including many, I'm sure, who are on the call today. Mental health and psychosocial support is even integrated into the former DFID, the Department for International Development's education strategy in the UK, which is now the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, but that strategy will continue. So at the very highest level of UK education development policy, there's a recognition that mental health is critical to education in emergencies. And even here in the UK with refugees, as Louka said, what's something I've been working on over the past kind of year or so, poor mental well-being has been identified by young refugees as one of the biggest hindrances to their education progression. So progressing from school to further education or further education to higher education. It's really one of the things that comes out strongly, that young people's poor mental health, whether that's about trouble sleeping and therefore missing classes, or it's about the application process to further and higher education, which one of our key informants in our research told us was extremely triggering for young people, of the rejection and the challenges that came with that. We really know that poor mental well-being is a hindrance for young people who have experienced trauma. But what we haven't looked as much at is when there's non-conflict educational disruption and what that means for young people. And that's really what COVID has allowed us a glimpse into. So to start with, I wanted to share some findings that we had from a survey we did with teachers and with children and with parents. So Unicef UK did a survey with about 1,500 teachers from across the 4 nations of the UK in May of this year. And we found that over 80% identified mental health as a top priority. So teachers were asked to label their top 5 or identify their top 5 priorities for returning to school, and mental health was overwhelmingly one of the top 5. It came second only to physical health and PPE specifically, so protection gear for teachers. So definitely a top concern, and over half of them cited that supporting children who'd suffered trauma or abuse was a really key concern for them. And similarly, parents were reporting, more than half of parents in our survey. So we did a survey with 750 parents of school-age children. More than half reported that their children had experienced some kind of mental problem. 27% said that they were worried about their children's health every day, mental health every day, and 29% said they were actually struggling to reassure their children. But I think most concerningly, and perhaps the people who we should listen to most, are children. And so we did a survey. Certainly the people we should listen to most are children in this case. The children told us, 62% of children in our survey, this was another survey of 750 young people, 62% said they were worried about the impact of the coronavirus, 46% said they had anxiety or worry, and more than half said that homeschooling was stressful. And I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise to any parents out there. I'm sure homeschooling is very stressful from a parental perspective. But certainly children were also finding it stressful. And we have all that learning from refugee and asylum seeking education or education emergencies, that's a real barrier to education. And so now we've seen that young people are self-reporting that there's mental health challenges with the lockdown. So it's really something that I think has indicated this challenge even further. And we also heard from teachers and from parents that support was really needed. So quite worryingly, only 1 in 5 teachers thought they had adequate mental health counselling services within their schools to support children when they returned. Almost a third said that additional mental and emotional support was the one thing they would want if money was provided. And that was an open-ended question, so they could write anything. And the most common response was mental and emotional support, which I think is really striking. And yet almost a quarter of parents noted that the most important thing the government could do was to support children through funding for essential services such as schools, health, and well-being. So there's a lot of recognition that more needs to be done in this space, including in relation to children, parents, and teachers self-reporting about mental health challenges. That's not to say that work hasn't been done. There's been lots and lots of focus on this area, which is fantastic. There's been guidance and campaigns from Unicef. There was an amazing piece of work that Unicef China did where they spoke with children and young people, identified their concerns about returning to school, and then made child-friendly communications based on those concerns to really ensure a positive transition back to school. We've also seen additional funding and training from the Department for Education in England. Education has devolved in the UK, so we have different nations have different policies. And the Welsh Government has been updating their whole school approach to mental health in relation to the impacts of COVID. So lots of great work in that area. And that has shown that we've learned from the pandemic, right? So COVID-19 has been a global unifier, which I think Louka touched on in education, whether that's in terms of mental health challenges across countries, or whether that's about the challenges of distance learning, and or that's about having the digital divide, or it's about children with disabilities struggling with access. There's lots and lots of things that have really shown that while our contexts are very different, our challenges are quite similar from time to time, and especially during times of educational disruption like COVID. We've seen that mental health interventions have really been recognized and valued more than ever, certainly in some places. And I mean, you can see that just from the funding alone that's come, and the training programs that have been developed here in the UK, in England specifically. There's been lots and lots of focus on this. We heard from our teachers that it's actually facilitated positive conversations about mental health. So because everyone is finding it challenging to be at home, for instance, they've been able to have more open and honest conversations with their pupils about what the challenges might be of home learning and of living through COVID. And finally, there have been more discussions about new ways of supporting mental health in schools and in communities. Certainly something that we've seen, and I'll touch on that again in a moment. But I also think that there are quite a lot of risks, and this is what I mean when I said that there are some learnings. So we've heard the Welsh Government was looking at their whole school approach and then questioning if a whole school approach is enough. Are we talking more about a whole community approach? What role is there for parents? And I think one of the really interesting things that the Welsh Government recognized was that often teachers aren't the trusted confidant of young people, or they're not the trusted adult of young people. But when you're not engaging with janitorial staff or school kitchen staff or your sports coaches, what happens to that whole school approach? And does it need to go further than that? And that's one of the things where we've kind of been thinking slightly differently. Again, what happens during distance learning? What kind of support can you be giving? What kind of skills do educators need to have in order to support that? How do you facilitate those positive conversations that are starting to arise? How do you balance the focus on skills and mental health? We've been talking a lot about digital skills and digital connectivity and media literacy and all of these kinds of important things, but how do you balance that with that welcome focus on mental health? And finally, how do you continue the positive focus on mental health to unlock learning, which we've seen it in refugee education, and now we're starting to see it through COVID. How do you not lose that when we then go back to classroom learning? And that's really important because this is not the last challenge that we know we will see. It's not the last bit of educational disruption that we know we will face in the coming years. Not just because of pandemics, which are tied to climate change as well, but also things like climate displacement. And Louka mentioned this is an area of my particular interest. So as we see more children affected by climate change, more children having to move through slow onset crises and immediate crises, are we building education systems that are really not just infrastructurally ready for those big moves and those big changes or those immediate changes, but actually also building resilience and recognizing that education transitions are really difficult if you don't have that mental and psychosocial support that you would need? Are we taking all of that learning from refugee education, carrying it through COVID and then through to climate change? And I think that's something that we can really take out of this crisis. We say that COVID was a test paper and climate change is the final exam. So can we ace it is the question. And then how do we keep a focus on mental health, like I said, when other priorities are taking over? Louka mentioned that climate change is starting to take a back seat, but it's what children tell us is incredibly important to them. In fact, they have a lot of anxiety about it, especially in Australia. There's been numerous reports about youth anxiety about climate change. But how do we keep that focus on mental health as we're worried about infrastructure, for example, in communities affected by climate change? And so I think that's another thing that we can bring out of COVID. So I've kind of, as to use your word, Louka, orbited around the questions. But those are some additional questions for us to consider, and also hopefully some learning we can take out of the pandemic and build stronger education systems as we move forward. That's it for me.
Anya, thank you very much. Beautifully positioned, I think. And certainly, you know, COVID as the teacher at this moment, you know, what are the learnings that we've actually been able to take from this time together? I do like this insight. COVID is the test paper, climate change is the final exam. And also, you know, the idea of mental health being kind of the way to unlock learning, and that really learning is locked unless, you know, we know that young people feel well, feel supported. And so how we do that, particularly with the different levels of intervention, you know, whole school, whole community, you know, for mental health for all, and then of course mental illness and some of the kind of quite, you know, pointy parts of the field, and how do we ensure that, you know, the really significant supports are being delivered as well, for all. And I know that Carine is actually going to take us into some of that, and also take us a bit through the field of psychosocial and social emotional learning, and what do we know so far, and how do we try to answer some of those questions as well. Although I don't know if we'll answer them all, because there's a beautifully put, Anya, but it's my pleasure to introduce Carine. The one thing I would also say as we progress to hear from Carine's insights is that we have the chat box, and, you know, Anya's posed a good range of questions that we'll try to, you know, cover ourselves. But if you have some particular questions, no question is a dumb question, not when we're learning. So please put them into the chat. I'll monitor that, synthesize them, and then I'll put them to both Carine and Anya at the end. So it's my pleasure to introduce Carine Allaf. She's the Senior Programs Advisor at Qatar Foundation International in Washington, DC. Although she normally works across all programming, she focused primarily on the international programs at QFI, including Arabic dual language immersion programs, monitoring, evaluation, and research. She's been part of QFI's work since 2011 and has worked in education, development, and the not-for-profit sector for over 15 years as a teacher, scholar, and practitioner in both the United States and the Arab world. She's worked at the American Community School in Beirut, Lebanon, Teachers College, Columbia University's International Education Development Program, Save the Children in Iraq, and Unicef in Jordan, Sudan, and Palestine. She has also served as a consultant at the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, INEE, on a variety of projects. She holds a BA from Lehigh University and an MA in elementary education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and a PhD in comparative and international education from the University of California in Los Angeles. Fantastic experience and insight, Carine. I yield the floor to you to take us through education in a state of emergency. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Louka. Thanks so much. And thanks, Anya, for your presentation. There's some nice intersections with what I'm about to speak about. So in preparing for today's presentation, I actually was able to reflect. Oh, no, I can't switch it. Uh-oh, here. Oh, wait. Okay, there we go. It allowed me to reflect on my own journey with education in emergencies, and Louka in my bio kind of explained the various parts and roles that I've had leading up to this point. And what I wanted to do with this slide is really demonstrate that my experiences with emergencies, and specifically when it comes to education, has really also been a key driver in who I am as a person. When I speak about the lessons learned from my work in EIE, so education and emergencies, and on the next slide, and when I get into the meat of the presentation, it's important to keep in mind what I have experienced to inform these conclusions that I'm making today. So first and foremost, I was born in Lebanon and raised in Kuwait, but because my dad left Lebanon when he was young, interrupting his own education for economic prosperity in the Gulf. And then when he had his own children, me and my siblings, my dad would always say, education is everything, without it, you're blind. And he prioritized it in every aspect of our lives. So when in 1990, my own life was turned upside down overnight by the invasion of Iraq into Kuwait, we were fortunate enough to have already been on a plane headed to the United States, and only learned that we were the second to last flight to leave Kuwait before the Iraqis entered when we landed in the United States. And it was because of our education, my dad decided it was best that we stayed in the US so that we experienced no interruption in our schooling. we were also quite fortunate that my dad had the social and economic capital to make these choices, or to be able to even make these choices. Then later on in my teaching career, when I first started as a primary school teacher, I was student teaching in New York City when 9/11 happened. And then later in Beirut, I was teaching within a mile of attempted assassinations and the culmination of the killing of the Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri in 2005. And it wasn't really until I entered into the formal education and emergency space later on in my career that I was able to reflect back on all the various decisions and actions I was making as a teacher in these conflict situations. So it wasn't until I worked in Jordan and Iraq, and then later at Teachers College teaching about these issues, and then with consultancies in East Jerusalem, Sudan, Sri Lanka, that I was able to really think about the theory and the foundations behind all the things that I was experiencing and doing ever since I was a small child to my own career. So fast forward now to my work with Qatar Foundation International, QFI, where we work with our teachers and schools globally who are dealing with this pandemic daily, in addition to parenting two small children who are in the New York City public school system. So here I am speaking from a variety of perspectives and viewpoints: the teacher, the donor, the policymaker, the academic, the practitioner, and the beneficiary, and then the mom as well. So overall, the main point I want to make before I really dive in is education in emergency settings, in the humanitarian context. To Louka, what you said, that the immediate is not prioritized. Only 2.1% of humanitarian funding actually goes towards education. And although we know that mental health and psychosocial education is really important, Anya made a really strong case for that, we're not necessarily seeing the action behind it. So today, I want to kind of draw on the four, for me, key learnings that I'm taking from the education and emergencies space. So as Anya also talked about and Louka in the opening, conflict and crisis are becoming more so the norm in a variety of contexts. So from the wildfires in developed countries like Australia and here in the US to the current global state of the pandemic, we shouldn't look at conflict and crisis as only these humanitarian scenarios that happen in far developing countries, but rather looking at it as conflict and crisis like it's ongoing and everywhere, that ebbs and flows on a continuum from humanitarian to development to developed context. So the first key learning is that preparedness and disaster risk reduction is essential. And I know, Anya, you spoke about this as well. Education systems globally must be prepared for these shutdowns and changes at any point due to numerous conditions, including threats of climate change. The COVID-19 shut education systems worldwide seemingly overnight, and it exposed how unprepared the most developed contexts were. So preparedness is imperative to make sure that our education systems are prepared for any future shocks that are sure to come. The second takeaway is that psychosocial and mental health is paramount and key. And also these key learnings are not in any order. They're all very important. This has been stated: without taking care of yourself, no learning will take place. And the key for me here is that you have to make sure that all your adults, all the people working in an education delivery model, and as Anya spoke about, the janitorial staff, the cafeteria staff, the administrative staff, the tech people, anybody who is working, and nowadays the parents, the sitters, the caregivers, anybody who's working in education delivery has been taken care of as well. Often our focus is really the learners and we forget about the adults. Really interestingly, in September 2020, there was a report from the Labor Department in the United States that stated that women are leaving the workforce at 4 times the rate of men due to this pandemic to take on the schooling duties and the homeschooling duties. So the mental health implications of this current pandemic are huge, and they need to be explicitly addressed and not be viewed as unintended consequences. So we at QFI are also seeing this feedback from our educators. We work with not only language teachers, but also with teachers who teach in a variety of disciplines about the Arab world. And they span from teaching the littlest kids at 3 and 4 years old to the oldest students in 12th grade or senior year of high school, of secondary school. So the toll this pandemic is taking on them has been evident from the very start of the pandemic in March to right now, the return to the current school year. So some educators are just scared to return to the classroom, and this has led to indefinite leaves of absences or even early retirements. Educators, whether they're the in-person model, the hybrid model, or the all virtual model, are dealing with the ever-changing and increased workloads. For example, those who are in the classroom with students have a changed workload to ensure that students wear masks, are socially distancing, and are following the COVID-19 protocols that have been put in place, and that also change. And also teachers that are teaching remotely have to deal with troubleshooting technology issues, and then need to adapt these lesson plans to the virtual space and to figure out how to engage their remote learners. So stress levels for teachers are at an all-time high. And finally, on this, take away the importance of psychosocial and mental health. Having this notion of remote schooling, we are now looking into people's homes, and educators are also getting front row seats to the home lives of their students, and they're witnessing abuses at home, and the responsibility that has suddenly been thrust onto their shoulders is immense. And they don't have the training or the background to really be able to deal with that, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. Third key learning for me is the coordination and communication with key stakeholders. And this is paramount. I know in the EIE world, I often sat at high level meetings where discussions were totally off the mark of what was actually happening in classrooms and in schools, in informal learning centers. And there is a whole aid and coordination network in the humanitarian world that is meant to be in the coordination wheel. But I'm also seeing in today's pandemic, especially here in the United States, districts and schools are trying to figure this out as they go. And policies that seem to be COVID safe are a logistical nightmare for teachers to manage in their own classroom. Mandates are evolving by the hour, and teachers are left to figure out how to manage their classrooms with little to no notice. And the models that we hear about, this hybrid, the in-person, the remote, mean different things in different settings, and teachers are trying to figure out how to actually implement them for their own scenarios. And again, I'm speaking mostly about the UK, the US is primarily where QFI is working, but it's similarly to all the various contexts that I've worked in. One extreme example of this is comes from a teacher in our network in Austin, Texas. So they had a full-time virtual model, and then they switched it to in-person, but because of the ratio and the student numbers, it's really ended up being one student that's in the class and the rest are virtual, and the teacher has to manage the in-person student with the rest of the class being remote. And another example is in New York City, families can opt out of in-person at any moment, therefore changing your numbers. And conversely, the remote families can opt into in-person. So you can just imagine day to day, how many kids am I going to have? What is this going to look like? That will make a huge impact on what a teacher is doing. And then the last lesson learned for me is that you have to go with what works. We often look for these big, innovative, fancy ways to try to solve problems. And there are things that we know work from developing countries are resource low contexts as well. So things like radio, TV, sharing messages on WhatsApp, texts, phone calls are things that we know work that could be drawn on and used more in this COVID world. All right. So here on this slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about just making sure we're setting the scene for what we mean by psychosocial support and social emotional learning. And I also want to say that the next 3 slides, so this slide and the next 2 slides, come from the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. And if you're not familiar with their work, I highly recommend you check out their website. The INEE has lots of modules on psychosocial and mental health and social emotional learning in education in emergencies, and they're also putting on a lot of webinars related to COVID. So in this slide, psychosocial support really is the process and actions that promote holistic well-being of a person in their social world, and it really facilitates that resilience for individuals, families, and communities, the resilience that Anya spoke so nicely about that we really need to be building up. And then social and emotional learning is a very much an important component of that psychosocial support. And it's these processes and these skills that people need to be able to have well-being. I think the key for social emotional learning that it has to be intentionally linked to academics. It's designed and implemented in learning spaces, and it's a component of the school curriculum. It shouldn't be like it shouldn't be an add-on. It should be really in everything that a school is doing with their education delivery. So here is a nice chart that looks at the SEL needs. And this is looking at the strategies that school and district leaders can use to provide psychosocial support to students and staff so that learning can effectively take place. So on the blue side is the social emotional learning needs. And on the light blue side is the possible interventions. At QFI over the last 3 years, we've been working on a study called the Study of Adolescent Lives After Migration to America, SALAMA, with Dr. Lindsay Stark at the Washington University in St. Louis. And this study looks at the mental health and psychosocial needs of Arabic-speaking adolescents in public schools. And one of the biggest takeaways or key recommendations from the study is really about this first sense of belonging and value, and really drawing on the cultural and linguistic value of students, working with the families, making sure that there's that language support, the cultural support, making sure the families understand the expectations. And this, I think, is a learning that we can really apply to today's COVID world, especially with the distance learning and the remote and the using the computer. There's some other kind of learnings here, the sense of normalcy, the relationship with others, building that relationship with your students, building the relationship between students themselves as well. On the next slide is the intervention pyramid. I think this is really important when we are looking at answering the question of tangible ways that leaders can create environments that help students and staff to thrive in times of long-term uncertainty. I think what I have found in my work in this field is that we do quite well in the bottom levels. Where we have difficulty is that the specialized services at the very top. And I think something that I see is missing, and what we've also found from our work with Salama, is that often there really isn't a referral mechanism in place when teachers find students who need those specialized services, and not only just the referral mechanism, but an actual process of what to do with that. And here you can even say more about families as well, and also the teachers themselves and the adults that are in place. So what happens when they need that higher level and more specialized services? And then I think because of just time, I think I will end there and leave the rest for the Q&A. Thanks, Louka.
That's fantastic, Carine. Thank you so much. I'll start with this singular question, because I think many people, and Sam in the chat has said he agrees with everything that we've been outlining. The question I think he's posing is, how do we get between the kind of the knowing to the doing? And both of you have kind of called for the idea of investment, and the first step towards emancipation is consciousness, as Norman Fairclough would say. But how do we get to kind of the embedding of these kinds of approaches, be it in terms of the intervention pyramid, or the idea of having mental health core on the agenda, and kind of hardwiring that into one of the things that we pay attention to moving forward, particularly for the adults. And I think both of you have outlined that. Carine, also from a personal level, everyone is working from home, but people are also living at work, which is the other way to kind of phrase all the kind of stresses and the different roles that so many people are juggling with kind of the uncertainty, the mass uncertainty that exists. So very difficult question. It's a question I often wonder about in my own work. How might we get from the idea of knowing that these things are required, but then actually putting them into action? So how have you seen policies really turn into practices or programs, in a really powerful way, both in the EIE field or in education more generally? Straight to the easy questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. For me, what I have found, and this might be a little controversial, but it's, we right now, even though we say mental health and social emotional learning is really important, and so I think I'm preaching to the choir with this audience that it is important. When you look at what is being assessed and valued when it comes to exit exams, entry into higher education, we're not really looking at that, and we're not really prioritizing it. So when it comes to thinking about education delivery, we're thinking about, oh my gosh, they're not going to learn their math, or they're not going to learn their science, and we need to make sure they have this understanding to be able to exit the schooling system and enter into the higher ed system. there's rumblings of change, but I haven't seen actual fundamental change. And I think it's going to be top down and bottom up, where the value on assessments, the value on admissions to higher ed, the value of entry into the labor market dictate what we're valuing at the primary and secondary level. I think it's shifted, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, from when I was teaching in Beirut to now. I definitely think there's been changes, but I think we still have more work to be done to make it an actual reality. And funding is a big one. I think if we could shift the needle, so for child protection and education, if there's more funding being put towards those two, I get that, wash and sanitation and nutrition are equally as important, but there needs to be funding put towards things like education and child protection to also increase its value.
Thank you. Anya, what about what would you offer us here?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question. I think one of the things that that we haven't done, as Carine says, is kind of make that case for mental health as a prerequisite for learning. And it's one of the things we've talked a lot about when we've been engaging with the Department for Education here in the UK about what should be prioritized when children return to school. And it's about not trying to set it forward as a dichotomy of learning outcomes or mental health and social and emotional learning. Actually, the latter enables the former. And I think as Carine says too, there's starting to be some moves on that, but we'd have a lot more work to do to really make the case for that. And I think research into that would be really helpful to kind of, in high income and in low income countries and in conflict settings and in non-conflict settings, it would be helpful to have that research to really indicate what kind of is known anecdotally, just to illustrate to policymakers that this is really key when you're designing curricula. And I think that would also help as we kind of look forward to new curricula, or as we're looking at building more resilience into education systems, to have that kind of knowledge embedded from the beginning that these two are not separate. And again, these are quite lofty ideas. They're not tangible on the ground. For tangible on the ground things, I would say it's not just about learning about or teaching and embedding it in the curriculum, but also the school environment that children are walking into. And I think one of the things that we hear we did a big research piece on education transitions for young refugee and asylum seeking children in the UK. And we heard that very, very simple changes can make a massive difference. So we're producing fact sheets where literally one of the recommendations for practitioners is smile when a young person walks into your admissions office. Have someone who will knows how to respond to emails and will respond to emails from young refugees. Really tiny changes that can make a more positive environment, a happier environment, that then will change a little bit of culture, and then from that enable a bit more learning. So kind of really tangible on the ground, and then a little bit bigger ideas.
That's great, Anya. I want us to unpack a little bit about, because I think this is the key question that Sam has posed us that we can kind of riff off for a little while, is, the segmentation that we are obsessed with, and the kind of different value sets that we apply to different skills. So, we can look at high stakes assessment, for example, and the idea of academics, and largely those of us working in the social emotional learning field, even, it's actually a social emotional academic learning field. We're just trying to elevate the social and the emotional so that they are seen as equally valued. And as you say, Anya, not dichotomous in any sense. Good learning is social, emotional, and cognitive by design and by experience. And yet somehow we've kind of decided to compartmentalize everything out and kind of divide everything. And that's across our entire society, I would suggest. So what do we think about the role of the community, in that specific point around culture? And I think, Carine, you might have picked on this as well. How do we get every member of a school community? How do we think ecologically, to use that term, about a learning ecosystem, as opposed to the school, the home, as separate constructs? Because, never before have they been so integrated. If you can ask any parent about that right now. So yeah, what would be your offer about how we try to get some, I don't know if orbiting is the right verb I think focused on today, but how do we get everybody kind of focused on these things in a way that's coherent, as opposed to, a bit disjointed perhaps?
Yeah, I think, so in the work that we've done with Salam, what we found is that the adolescents who have done the most well are the ones whose families have been integrated into the school environment and are involved. You know, there's a learning curve for a new immigrant into the US to learn about school culture and understand what it's like, especially for families who maybe are coming from a segregated education system into now where they're going to school with boys and girls, or just how do things work in a US setting. And this is, take away COVID, this is just from, you know, a resettlement kind of perspective. Then put on top of it COVID, there's a whole other learning curve there. And I think being explicit that the school community is engaging and targeting those family members, if there's a cultural or linguistic gap, accessing people in the community that can then support and nurture those families in, so that it's not that the child just comes to school and we're only dealing with the child, that we are doing. And I know we always talk about involvement of parents, and it's been in education for years and years, but I do think that that's really kind of important to make sure that the family is very much involved and is aware as much as they can, as they can be. And I think, you know, it's now with COVID, it's really, that line has been completely blurred, and teachers and parents are co-educators in this year together. And so I think there is, if we haven't seen a shift before, I think you will see a shift after, just because now we've been able to step in each other's shoes, and teachers themselves also have their kids at home. And I think there's been a little bit of, be a paradigm shift just simply because of the experiences of this year. I don't know, Anya, I'll stop there to give you a chance.
No, I completely agree. I think we've always known, kind of in definitely in educational development spheres, but education policy spheres generally, that parental engagement is critical. And COVID has just really highlighted that. And it's almost similar, I kind of feel, to the digital divide, that we kind of only thought about it as a homework problem, when actually it's a learning problem, or not problem, problem's too hard a word, but a challenge that some children face, and definitely a difference between children who have parents at home who are engaged in their learning, or who have a laptop, or who have resources at home. These are all differences that create in the home environment. But I think, and that kind of is slightly different from your question, but it does make me think about something that has also come out strongly, which is around lifelong learning, and how we're engaging parents who either have lower levels of education, or who haven't had the same opportunities. How are we offering those families opportunities, but recognizing that that's really challenging, because it's not how our education systems are built, and it's not how our education systems are funded, for example. So I think changing slightly how we value things, but again, seeing them as these unlockers for learning. It's not about saying that we value adult education more than anything, or that we value social and emotional learning more than anything, but that all of those things are critical for creating not just a whole school approach, but a whole community approach to enable all children to get those critical skills that will get them jobs in the end, if that's the kind of trajectory that you see education putting young people on. How we do that is kind of the next question, I suppose, or part of the question, but it's definitely something that I think COVID has hopefully given us some space to really reflect on, and really shown in a lot starker detail than perhaps previously.
Yeah, that's great, Anya. I can't recall if I heard somebody say, but I love the sentiment that's, you know, crises disrupt, but they also reveal. And so I think your point about, you know, what we saw as an access gap for homework, when schools go virtual in parts of the world, it is a full-blown learning challenge. It's a complete access gap. So, you know, and looking at different countries and different jurisdictions take different approaches, be it going, you know, in Mexico to a TV delivery approach for 30 million children, you know, other parts. There's lots of different ways that countries are trying to solve that challenge, you know, with varying levels of success, I suppose. My question I have for you both is about leadership, because, you know, if this crisis has revealed anything, it's about the need for compassionate, virtuous, empathetic leadership as we try to lead countries through this quite remarkable moment in our history. So What would you say around education leadership, and what reflections would you offer to people that are in situations right now, perhaps as a superintendent or as a regional director? There might be a school principal, there might be leading a community organization that is looking at trying to keep the ecosystem communicating and coordinated, to your point about one of your takeaways, Carine. So what would be some of your reflections on the leadership that might be required now to enable mental well-being and mental health, not just mental illness, to kind of be hardwired and centralized in the way we pay attention to what education needs to be?
Yeah, so to answer that question, I'm going to reflect back to when I was a teacher in Beirut and my school principal at the time, who I hold dearly in my heart. And when this all started happening, I'm Lebanese, so I know about this conflict. Growing up, we used to come visit and there was bombings and things. It's not that I kind of knew how to deal with it, but it was something I knew happened in Beirut. But you had teachers from all over the world who had never been exposed to anything like this before. And before you know it, there's these explosions happening right out of your window, and you see clouds of smoke, rising, and you don't know what to do with your students. And she was not coming from a conflict affected zone, but her focus was immediately on our well-being as teachers and on the families and on the students. There was no talk of, did you do this assignment, or where are you with reaching these standards? And if I reflect back to those months, the focus was really on students, teachers, families' hearts, and making sure everybody was okay. And so that is huge. That means a lot. And then now looking at where we are currently, even looking at the New York City response for schooling and the feedback we're getting from the teachers where my kids go to school, this fear of opening schools, this fear of, there's a picture on my slide where it says, this is not ventilation. That's from my kid's school in New York City, where there's this emphasis, you need to have this much ventilation on both sides of your windows, where 60% of the windows in our building don't do that, but yet it's open for kids to come back, and the pressure of that on the adults in the building, the responsibility of that. So it's where the leaders are putting their focus, really, I think makes a difference to the general kind of feeling of families and teachers responding in times of crisis.
Yeah. Anya?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, kind of focus on your mental health and well-being and the environment your school is in. I'm not a teacher, and I've not been a teacher, and I think it's really important to say that I don't have classroom experience, and so I wouldn't wish to speak for people who do have classroom experience, because I know that is invaluable, and I have infinite respect. I always say those who can do, those who can't teach, and those who can't teach advocate, which is what I do. But I guess the thing I would say about school leaders and what I would hope and that we could encourage with them is to really focus on their own well-being and on their staff's well-being, and that as I think Carine said, it starts from the bottom and it starts from the top. And when we say top, we don't just mean the top of society or ministers. It's also the top of the school. And if you set this taking care of yourself is really important, and taking care of your staff is really important, and that creates this enabling environment where I hope it would create an enabling environment where the questions you ask yourself are meaningful. Are you okay? How are you doing? You took a day off yesterday. Is there anything I can do to help? In the same way that I'm sure we all do with our colleagues every day. And I've been really lucky to have an incredibly supportive working environment, and I can only imagine that unlocks sort of more learning and more productivity, and hopefully stronger conversations with your students as well.
Yeah, great, Anya. If we take the gold standard as kind of positive culture of belonging, really embedded practices of social, emotional, and cognitive learning, and then also programs that support all of that from an ecological lens, like that description is pretty hard to pull off. And we've got a question here from Denise Dodson. So, if you're a teacher right now and you just want to, this is new to you, you want to kind of just put in some really practical, small things tomorrow for your class, what is one thing you would recommend? And it might be a resource, it might be something else, and I'll start, Denise. I would recommend kind of the kernels of practice work by Stephanie Jones and her colleagues at the EASL Lab at Harvard. They have some wonderful, very simple, free, low investment practices that actually can be as simple as smiling or a mindful minute at the beginning of a lesson. And these things, activate the relaxation response, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we want to do, because as we've heard, we want to create those conditions so that powerful learning can actually take place, or productivity. And so that would be my offer, and I'll put a link into that as well. But Carine and Anya, what would be your offer, like a resource or some kind of one thing that you would recommend for a teacher who wants to be part of this change?
I mean, I think you took my answer a little bit, Louka, is mindfulness. I would definitely incorporate mindfulness into your day. It doesn't take long. There's a ton of resources out there. The Louka Foundation just put out a document about integrating play in remote learning and distance learning, and mindfulness is part of that as well. So I think just taking a few minutes and teaching your students, no matter what their age, from the littlest to the oldest, that let's breathe and let's really think, let's get a state of intention for the day, for what we're about to embark on, is going to make a huge difference for them and for you as an educator.
Great.
I would just say to talk about it, to kind of not be afraid to talk about your own challenges, recognizing that obviously there's opportunities for learning how to do that best, and there's lots of training out there, and there's lots of resources that you, Louka, and Carine have highlighted, and I'm sure that Knowledge Hook highlights as well. But just to feel confident in talking about the how challenging COVID is, and see it as kind of that unifier of we're all going through a similar experience. And I think being unafraid to talk about it, and I go back to kind of our own workplace examples, the best, and our own friend examples, the easiest way to have a conversation with someone about any challenges you think they might be facing, or if you would really like to offer them an opportunity to speak, is to kind of offer your own experience. And so I think starting on that journey is just about having that conversation, and maybe that starts with mindfulness and taking a few moments in the morning, and then it's about reflecting on what that might have brought up for us as a class or as a community, but really just starting the conversation. That's what I would say.
That's fabulous. We've only got a minute or so left before I'll hand back to Jen, but I would love just to yield the floor to you. If you have a take-home message or something that you think we should pay attention to as we progress beyond 2020, whatever that might bring. We know that it will bring continuing disruptions and uncertainty. So what is your kind of take-home message from your learning and your experiences so far?
Do you want to go first, Carine?
Yeah, go for it.
I would say let's just keep on this path. There's been a lot of thinking around SEL and mental health, and how that is important to learning, and just kind of keeping on that trajectory, supporting that narrative, and not returning to the normal, which I think is a lot of, I do think there's an acknowledgement that returning back to normal is not necessarily what we want. We want to reimagine education. And so thinking about what that means for you, and how reimagining education can keep on that journey to really facilitating more social and emotional learning, and more mental health support in schools, and more positive conversations as we continue to develop children's other skills, like the more academic ones. I think that's what I would say is the takeaway for me as we move into things like climate change and disruption from that as well.
Thanks, Anya. Great.
Yeah, I worry that this is just the beginning. I'm a little bit of a pessimist, I think, these days, and that this is going to become, I worry, the norm, and I worry for my small kids and their future, and I hope I am wrong. But I think we need to focus on the present as well, and not take for granted what is happening currently in our lives, in our moments, because I think pre-COVID, it really was like an overnight thing. We were just living our lives, taking things for granted, and not realizing the rug was pulled right from under us, even for people who have experienced conflict before in their lives. But I also don't lose sight of what's to come, and that preparedness piece, that being mindful of knowing that being flexible, being able to respond and react, and knowing that it's okay. That things will happen, there will be disruptions, but it is okay, and there's ways to work around it.
Fantastic, Carine. Thank you so much to you both. My offer is that maybe we are the people we've been waiting for. And so, thank you to both of you for joining us today, and also for your ongoing advocacy in this space. We know that this work matters. And so thank you to all for joining us. I'll hand back to Jen just to close us out.
Thanks, Louka. And again, on behalf of the people that have registered for this, as well as the people that joined us live, a huge thank you to the three of you for hosting a really interesting discussion. And, Carine and Anya, as you were talking about the populations that you serve, kids that are refugees or displaced, I thought of that expression, good for some, necessary for some, good for all. And the practices that you were able to share that work with those populations, we know that we've got kids in all education systems around the world that need some of those practices. And some of those things like, a smile and reaching out. I spoke to a superintendent at the beginning of the pandemic, and their messaging to their school leaders and to their teachers was really focusing on making the connection with the kids. Don't worry about the academics in the beginning, make the connection. They need to hear you say their names in any way that you can. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. So thanks to all three of you. This has been this is one of our SEL Global Leadership Series, and we will continue. Like I said, the three partners are going to continue on a monthly basis. And just a reminder that you are welcome to connect. Harris, if you can just move the slide forward, please. You're welcome to connect to Karanga and over to there, and as well to Salzburg Global Seminar. Our very next roundtable is taking place on October the 22nd, and it is privacy in a remote learning world. And we've had lots of questions from education leaders talking about this whole concept of privacy. How do we ensure that student information and family information is kept private when we're sending out and working on virtual platforms? So we think that one will be a good discussion, and we look forward to seeing you there as well. Thanks to everybody. Have a great day.